Tony Fauci has been at NIAID, the National Institute for Infectious and Allergic Diseases, for 50 years. The only way that you last for 50 years in that job is if you are a guy who knows how to do exactly what the pharmaceutical industry tells you to do. That's the only way that he has lasted there. And by the way, he arrived there in 1968, and the level of allergic disease in our country and chronic disease was 12% when he arrived there. Today, it's 54%. And thanks to Tony Fauci, Americans take 3 times the number of pharmaceutical drugs as any other country in the world. And we pay the highest prices for pharmaceutical drugs. And the 3rd biggest killer of Americans are pharmaceutical drugs. And virtually all of the drugs that have been approved in our country since about 1990 have been drugs that have come out of Tony Fauci's shop, because he develops drugs for the pharmaceutical industry. That's what he does with all his money. He's not sitting in there studying, well, I wonder why all these kids now have peanut allergies. He has never asked that question. Why do all these people have immune disease, autoimmune diseases? Where do they come from? You know, there's suspects other than vaccines, as you know. There's a number of suspects of possible culprits where the timeline is right. Okay, there's glyphosate from, Monsanto's Roundup. There's neonicotinoid pesticides. There are EMFs from cell phones. There are sonograms, which became ubiquitous after, in the mid-1990s. And then there are PFOAs. There's a limited number of about probably 12 to 15 toxic exposures that became ubiquitous on that timeline, where you could say that could be a suspect. It has to be environmental. What's making all of our kids have chronic disease? It has to be environmental, because genes do not cause epidemics. They can provide the vulnerability, but you need an environmental toxin. So there's a limited number. And if you were head of NIAID for 50 years, don't you think you would go out and say, my job is to prevent chronic disease for Americans. I wonder where all these chronic diseases are coming from. That is a question that Tony Fauci has never asked and never answered. And, he's not a guy that you go to when you want public health policy. He has wrecked the public health of the American public. And he's been involved in all kinds of scandals, testing his HIV drugs on Black and Hispanic foster kids in these barbaric experiments that he got busted for in 2002 for Congress. He's a guy with no moral center. He's, we call him Teflon Tony, because he gets away with everything. The press never asks him. Wouldn't you love to be at that White House press conference and say, wait a minute, Mr. Fauci, Dr. Fauci, do you think it's possible that your gain of function studies that you funded at Wuhan were the things that released this virus? Exactly. So is that possible? Is it possible? Because a lot of people, including Nobel Prize winners like Luc Montagnier, say that that's exactly what happened. Now, Robert Kennedy, don't know. I know there's a tremendous amount of evidence that it did happen that way. And yet nobody from the press has ever asked him that question, because they're all owned by the pharmaceutical companies. And so for, Joe Biden or anybody to say, what we're going to do now in the United States of America, which is the model democracy, the exemplary democracy of the planet, is we're going to forget all about democracy, and we're going to do what Tony Fauci tells us to do. Even though nobody's ever asked Tony Fauci another more important question. How many people do you kill when you quarantine the entire economy of the United States of America for 8 months. How many people die when you permanently close 1 million businesses bankrupt? How many people are going to die over time when you run up these huge debts that cannot be paid except by liquidating our special education, our aids to women with infant children, our Medicaid, our Medicare, our Social Security system, our unemployment systems, our mental health systems, our prisons, all of those things. The whole New Deal that the Democratic Party put together over the past 90 years is about to be dismantled because of Dr. Anthony Fauci's decision, because all he knows, he's playing way out of his core competency. He's making these mandates. He says we need to do this to prevent deaths from coronavirus. He's not telling us how many deaths it's going to cost from suicides have doubled in our country. Alcohol sales have gone up something like 1,200%. And there are deaths of isolation and despair that are happening all of the time. And by the way, I don't mean to go on like this, but you got me like lit up. So, by the way, we had last year 1.5 million people die from tuberculosis worldwide. 10 million people got it a year. 10 million people a year. 1.5 million people dead from tuberculosis every year. That's more than coronavirus. It's a respiratory infection. Why didn't anybody tell us to wear masks 10 years ago? Why didn't Tony Fauci to prevent the tuberculosis scourge? Which is killing more people than coronavirus. You want me to tell you why?
Yes,
because
please.
There's no money in a TB vaccine. Because the patents are gone on those vaccines, and there's 20 companies making them, and they're not making any money. Who cares? What's the difference? Why is there nobody at that COVID weekly press conference saying to him, "Oh, Dr. Fauci, we lost 150% of the people that COVID is going to kill this year at its worst. Tuberculosis last year and this year. And by the way, the World Health Organization says because of the lockdown, an additional 1.3 million people will die of tuberculosis this year. So you're killing 1.3 million from tuberculosis to save 1 million from coronavirus, and you're not saving anybody.